Old Hollywood was of course as scandal-prone as contemporary show business. Many of the most famous, beloved, theater-filling stars of Hollywood's golden age found themselves dismissed from major motion pictures for reasons that might anger, upset, or sadden contemporary fans. Here are some bits of showbiz lore that turned out to be true. The actors tragically and shockingly fired from movies. Laurence Olivier wasn't good enough. Laurence Olivier is almost universally regarded as one of the finest actors of the 20th century. Rising up through the UK theatrical world, that country's top stage awards are named after him, and he was knighted by Queen Elizabeth II for his service to the arts. He'd ultimately earn 11 competitive Academy Award nominations, winning for acting in his self-directed take on William Shakespeare's Hamlet in 1948. But all those accolades came well into Olivier's career. In the early 1930s, Olivier entered into screen acting, landing roles in films like Friends and Lovers, The Yellow Ticket, and Queen Christina, a biopic about the 17th-century Swedish monarch. Olivier was new to the movies, and his lack of a reputation preceded him. Queen Christina star Greta Garbo had accepted the casting of Olivier as romantic lead Don Antonio, but then she filmed a love scene with him, and she decided he needed to go. What happened was that I started working with Garbo, and I just didn't measure up. I wasn't good enough for her, Olivier later said in a TV interview. But she was an absolute master of her trade, and she was a great figure and had an enormous image to the public. John Gilbert, Garbo's frequent co-star in her silent film era, would wind up portraying Don Antonio. Joan Crawford was so severely teased, she fell ill. Hush, hush, sweet Charlotte. A 1964 20th Century Fox thriller about a woman driven to insanity by family secrets was supposed to feature Bette Davis and Joan Crawford. They'd previously co-starred in the similarly campy 1962 horror movie Whatever Happened to Baby Jane. Just as their characters in that film were violent rivals, Davis and Crawford felt a similar animosity toward one another. During production of Hush, Hush, Sweet Charlotte, Davis frequently and loudly complained about Crawford, to her face and to the crew. For example, Davis criticized Crawford's character work in the middle of a rehearsal with director Bob Aldrich. Crawford stayed in her dressing room as much as possible. She internalized the stress to the point where she became physically ill and stepped away from filming when she checked into Cedars of Lebanon Hospital in Los Angeles with a fever and a cough. Production continued on Hush, Hush, Sweet Charlotte, as best as it could without one of its stars. Fox stood to lose $50,000 each day. Crawford's hospitalization led to delays, and the film's insurer issued an ultimatum to the movie makers: get a new actor to take over for Crawford, or scrap the movie. The former became the solution, with Olivia de Havilland hired at Davis's urging. Crawford learned she'd been fired when Hollywood gossip columnist Dorothy Manners telephoned her in her hospital room and asked how it felt to be fired and replaced. Clara Bo asked to be fired after a horrendous trial. The popular and enduring image of a young, independent American woman in the jazz age of the 1920s, commonly known as a flapper, is thanks in large part to Clara Bo. Known as Hollywood's it girl at the time, the trend-setting actor and sex symbol was a box office pull in the early and silent film industry, starring in dozens of movies including True to the Navy, Her Wedding Night, Love Among the Millionaires, and Wings, the first winner of the Academy Award for Best Picture. In 1930, Bo ceded control of her extensive fortune to Daisy DeVoe, her secretary, an arrangement that lasted less than a year. Bo fired DeVoe, who responded by stealing $20,000, financial paperwork, letters, and jewelry from the actor, and then announced plans to sue for unpaid salary. That suit didn't happen, but a dramatic trial did, after DeVoe was indicted on 37 charges of grand theft. Bo's spending habits came to light during the proceedings, as did excerpts of the very personal letters stolen by DeVoe, as they entered into the record as evidence. Deeply embarrassed by the ordeal, Bo checked into the Glendale Sanatorium, a mental hospital, in May 1931. At her request, and publicly framed as a mutual decision, Paramount fired Bo from her next film, City Streets. Bo retired from filmmaking and went to live on the Nevada ranch of her husband, actor Rex Bell. Vivian Lees' bipolar diagnosis precluded her from working. British actor Vivian Lees reportedly beat out more than 200 women to play Scarlett O'Hara in the 1939 film adaptation of Margaret Mitchell's best-selling, Pulitzer Prize-winning Civil War epic Gone with the Wind. She'd win an Academy Award for Best Actress and another for portraying Blanche Dubois in 1951's A Streetcar Named Desire. Within a year after taking home her second Oscar, Lee's career was in jeopardy because of difficult-to-manage health problems. According to The Hollywood Reporter, Lee began to demonstrate symptoms of bipolar disorder, or manic depression, via Healthline in the late 1930s, at one point enduring episodes of behavioral extremism on the set of Gone with the Wind. With no effective medication yet available to balance her moods, Lee was subject to moments of mania and sadness alike. Her behavior was so sad and unnerving to Elephant Walk producers that they summoned her husband, Laurence Olivier, to the film's Sri Lanka set. He wasn't able to help, and shortly thereafter filming moved to Los Angeles. Mental health episodes continued to befall Lee, where she suffered from bouts of extreme depression and leveled profanity-laced verbal attacks at others on set. Producers again sought outside help from actor associates. David Niven held Lee down, while a nurse delivered an intravenous dose of sedatives. After that, Lee was fired and returned to her home in London, and Elizabeth Taylor ultimately starred in Elephant Walk. George C. Scott showed up late. After dozens of roles in mostly individual episodes of television series and anthologies, George C. Scott seemed poised to solidify his substantial jump from small-screen character actor to big-screen leading man in the mid-1960s. After breaking through as unhinged General Buck Turgidson in Stanley Kubrick's multiple Oscar-nominated Cold War satirical comedy, Dr. Strangelove or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb, Scott was all set to star with Audrey Hepburn in the 1966 heist comedy How to Steal a Million. That movie's director, William Wyler, was among the most esteemed and powerful filmmakers in Hollywood, a 3-time Academy Award winner for Best Director against 12 total nominations. Wyler very much valued punctuality on his projects. The very first day of filming, Scott was an hour late to the set, Wyler told producer Lawrence Turman, according to the latter's memoir, So You Want to Be a Producer. I fired him immediately. The studio went crazy. They begged me to reconsider, but I stood firm. Spencer Tracy got drunk and pushy. Fox Film Corporation produced the 1935 horror movie Dante's Inferno, inspired by the 14th century narrative poem The Divine Comedy. Starring as morally flexible fairground operator Jim Carter, contract player Spencer Tracy, appearing in his 25th film for Fox since 1930. A few years before his back-to-back Academy Award for Best Actor wins for Captain's Courageous and Boys Town, Tracy didn't yet have a lot of movie business clout, but he still tried to effect change on the set of Dante's Inferno, insisting that filmmakers rewrite the script to his liking. At one point, Tracy started a physical fight with director Harry Lockman, and in an emotional tirade, reportedly destroyed whatever props, scenery, and lights were in the immediate vicinity before security guards could subdue him. During that particular incident, Tracy had shown up to work extremely drunk. Following the completion of filming, Fox executives met with Tracy and warned him to behave properly on his next movie. The actor immediately found a bar, and after drinking for 4 hours, returned to the Fox offices and confronted his bosses. They ended his contract immediately. Robert Mitchum got in a fight in films like Cape Fear, The Night of the Hunter, and Out of the Past. Tough guy actor Robert Mitchum often played intimidating and unapproachable figures. He was all set to star in 1955's Blood Alley as an American merchant ship captain who helps Chinese peasants abscond to Hong Kong. He didn't last long on the movie. Robert Mitchum has been fired after delaying production and refusing to apologize for creating disagreements among the production staff. A press release distributed by Warner Brothers said at the time, via Robert Mitchum, Baby I Don't Care, by Lee Server. Movie reporters descended on the Blood Alley set in San Rafael, California, where one overheard a crew member comment that Mitchum had been under the influence of drugs. always walking about 6 inches off the ground. He punched a guy, one of the drivers, knocked him into the bay, near killed him. In the wake of the firing and the speculation, Mitchum told his side of the story in a press conference held in his motel room. "It was all a result of my championing of the little guy," Mitchum said, dressed in his underwear and drinking wine from the bottle. "I want them treated right." Mitchum had evidently advocated for some crew workers who weren't being given necessary hygiene products by Warner Brothers, and in his telling, a confrontation over that issue had turned violent. Starring in Blood Alley instead, John Wayne. Clint Eastwood's appearance offended executives. For better or for worse, becoming a movie star is as much about appearance as it is about sheer acting talent or quality of performance. Conventionally attractive actors are often elevated to the A-list by movie studios, filmmakers, and receptive audiences because they possess a hard-to-define star quality, in that they just look like a movie star ought to look. Clint Eastwood, a bankable actor and major movie star from the 1960s onward, got his start as a Hollywood bit player in the 1950s. And his career almost ended before it really took off because some executives thought he lacked the necessary physical attributes required for film stardom. In 1959, Universal Studios ended its contractual agreement with Eastwood and his friend, fellow aspiring actor Burt Reynolds. He was fired because his Adam's apple stuck out too far. He talked too slow, Reynolds told CNN's Larry King Live in 2000, and he had a chipped tooth and he wouldn't get it fixed. Loretta Young tried to defy the studio system. It would have been extraordinarily scandalous and potentially career-ending for an unwed A-list Hollywood actor in the 1930s to give birth to a child. According to a BuzzFeed News interview with Loretta Young's daughter-in-law in 1935, the actress became pregnant via a sexual assault by megastar Clark Gable, her Call of the Wild co-star. Fox demanded that Young clandestinely abort the pregnancy. As a Roman Catholic and opposed to birth control and abortion, Young refused. So the studio, to which she was a contracted actor, concocted a story in which Young was reportedly convalescing from an unnamed illness in Europe. Young then quietly returned home to Los Angeles and gave birth to a baby girl, whom she then publicly adopted 19 months later. Her career back on track by 1939 with The Ruse a success, Young would once more refuse to do what her studio wanted, and her career suffered. Fox offered her a 5-year contract worth $2 million, and Young declined to sign. Attempting to go around the contract system, Young aimed to sign deals with individual studios. It didn't work. Unwelcome to most every studio in Hollywood, not just Fox, for challenging the way they did business, Young could only secure a role in one movie between 1939 and 1941, Eternally Yours, for United Artists. Ronald Reagan trashed his studio. In the 1930s and 1940s, Ronald Reagan was a contract player with Warner Brothers. Never a major box office draw or a particularly acclaimed actor, Reagan mostly headlined second-rate B-movies like The Voice of the Turtle, Stallion Road, and Santa Fe Trail. By 1950, Reagan had grown tired of unchallenging work, and he said as much to reporter Bob Thomas. He'd been forced to sit out movie making for most of 1949 after hurting his leg, and he planned on turning over a new leaf in his work. After spending most of the last year in bed, I'm going to concentrate on my career in 1950, Reagan told Thomas at the time, via Go Upstate. And there'll be some changes made. I'm going to pick my own pictures. I have come to the conclusion that I can do as good a job of picking as the studio has done. That interview was quickly published, and it crossed the desk of Jack Warner, head of Warner Brothers, Reagan's employer. Livid that Reagan would criticize his studio's films, he wrote to Reagan's agent, Lew Wasserman, to confirm the veracity of the interview. It was all true, and so later that year, when Reagan's contract came up for renewal, Warner purposely declined to re-sign. Reagan departed for Universal, at the time seen as a second-tier studio, where he made the comedy Bedtime for Bonzo, starring opposite a chimpanzee. Gene Kelly got angry and hurt himself. Gene Kelly ruled the world of big-budget movie musicals in the 1940s and 1950s. Not only did he star in and hoof his way through the likes of Anchors Aweigh, An American in Paris, and Singin' in the Rain, but he also devised and choreographed those films' elaborate dance numbers. When expert dancing was a major element of big-screen entertainments in the mid-20th century, Kelly's only real rival was Fred Astaire, and in 1947, he lost a role to Hollywood's other big male dancer-actor-singer due to an injury of his own creation. Filming was set to begin on Easter Parade in October 1947, and Kelly intended to spend 2 months preparing and choreographing the movie's dance sequences. On the day that screenwriter Sidney Sheldon turned in the final script to filmmakers, he was informed that Kelly had broken his leg. Kelly told MGM studio executives that he'd hurt himself practicing his dance moves. That was a lie to save face. He'd actually suffered a broken ankle during a volleyball game with friends. With every point his team ceded to the opposition, Kelly got angrier, eventually kicking a nearby doorframe so hard that he busted a bone. Kelly asked MGM to get rid of him and to bring him to Astaire. Judy Garland wasn't healthy enough to act. For the better part of a decade, Judy Garland was MGM's go-to performer for grand movie musicals. A captivating actor and extremely skilled singer, Garland starred in multiple classic song and dance pictures, including The Wizard of Oz in 1939 and Meet Me in St. Louis in 1944. When MGM, Garland's contracted studio for a decade and a half, entered production on the 1948 musical The Pirate, Garland was cast in the lead role of Manuela. During filming, Garland, who had long dealt with drug addiction, fully relapsed, relying on a variety of medications to both sleep and to stay awake. That exacerbated Garland's mental health issues. The actor would neglect to report for work, or would refuse to leave her dressing room if she did. After filming, she checked into a mental health facility, and upon returning to Hollywood, began work on the musical Annie Get Your Gun. Garland was cast in the title role, Wild West sharpshooter Annie Oakley. Her hospitalization hadn't brought Garland back up to her peak, in the view of MGM executives. After 1 month of shooting, the studio dismissed Garland and brought in Betty Hutton. The reason? She showed up late to the set too many times and sometimes intoxicated, appeared to have gained weight, and seemed generally too worn out and unreliable. Ray Milland refused a role. Signed to a 7-year contract in 1934, Ray Milland became a versatile leading actor for Paramount Pictures, almost always starring in movies marketed as lightweight, like comedies, westerns, and adventures. It was something of a surprise to even Milland himself when Paramount cast the actor in The Lost Weekend, a dark and difficult drama about an alcoholic writer who engages in a 4-day binge drinking session. "I wasn't at all sure I was ready for it," Milland said of the movie before filming began, via the Los Angeles Times. He lost weight for the role, got drunk in public for real, and spent the night in a New York hospital section for unhoused alcoholics. Milland was well rewarded for his role with an Academy Award for Best Actor in 1946. He thought he'd transformed his career and graduated to more serious fare, but his bosses at Paramount Pictures didn't necessarily agree. In 1948, the studio ordered him to star in a thriller called Bride of Vengeance. Milland refused to show up on the set, telling Paramount that he thought the role was beneath him and that the resulting film wouldn't be very good. Paramount placed the actor on a 2-month suspension and, in Bride of Vengeance, replaced Milland with actor John Lund. Marilyn Monroe didn't show up too many times. Marilyn Monroe became a legend in the 1950s, with roles as an object of desire in comedies like Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, How to Marry a Millionaire, and Some Like It Hot. In 1962, she started work on 20th Century Fox's Something's Got to Give. Monroe was coming off of a year-long hiatus, spent recovering from gallbladder removal and endometriosis surgeries, fighting drug addiction, and a hospitalization for depression. On the set of Something's Got to Give, Monroe had trouble recalling her dialogue, and crew members noted that she seemed to be both heavily drugged and deeply despondent. But that's if Monroe was around at all. She called in sick more than she showed up, her absences explained by notes from her doctors. In May 1962, after failing to report to the set for several days over illness, Monroe sang a sexy version of Happy Birthday to President John F. Kennedy, with whom she'd possibly enjoyed a dalliance, at an event in New York. Something's Got to Give, director George Cukor, who'd given Monroe the go-ahead to attend weeks earlier, got so angry that he had Fox fire the actor for her frequent absences. The studio then hit her with a $750,000 breach of contract lawsuit. Months later, Fox brought back Monroe after co-star Dean Martin refused to work with replacement Lee Remick. But before filming resumed, Monroe was found at her home, dead at age 36 from a fatal and likely intentional drug overdose. Buster Keaton didn't work well with his studio. Known as the Great Stone Face for his stoic reaction shots to the zaniness that surrounded his characters, Buster Keaton was among the most popular figures of silent film. Following hits like The General and Steamboat Bill Jr., Keaton's star had dimmed somewhat as movies with sound took hold, and in 1928 he signed an exclusive contract with Studio MGM. Executive Irving Thalberg assigned a studio employee to oversee Keaton's films, as well as devoting a whole team of writers and other crew members to the comedian's projects. MGM churned out movies in this efficient, stratified system, and Keaton wasn't used to that. As in the past, he'd been granted full creative control and hiring authority. Over the span of 4 years of working in the MGM manor, Keaton grew increasingly unhappy and felt creatively stifled. He coped with his discontent by drinking heavily, particularly on set. In 1932, MGM executive and co-founder Louis B. Mayer invited himself to a particularly intense and alcohol-fueled party, over which Keaton presided in his own dressing room. Resenting Mayer and viewing the unwelcome presence of the executive, as well as a bunch of Mayer's friends and their dates, as another instance of studio interference, Keaton erupted and threw his boss and his associates out of the party. Days later, Keaton refused to attend an important MGM public relations event. 2 days after that, MGM fired Keaton and began aggressively pursuing the Marx Brothers to be its new marquee comedians. Lita Gray got pregnant with the director's baby. An icon of silent cinema, Charlie Chaplin wrote and directed many of his movies, including the 1925 adventure comedy, The Gold Rush. He also starred as the Lone Prospector, a riff on his popular downtrodden tramp character. Chaplin handed the only significant female role in The Gold Rush to Lita Gray, real name Lilita McMurray, who at that time had appeared in just 2 films, The Idle Class and The Kid. They were both Chaplin movies, and Gray had been around 12 years old when they were produced. She was 15 when Chaplin signed her to a contract, placed her in The Gold Rush, and began a relationship with her. 6 months after filming began, Gray became pregnant with Chaplin's child. To avoid statutory rape charges, Chaplin married Gray in a secret ceremony in Mexico. Chaplin's publicity agent, Jim Tully, told reporters that Gray had quit not only The Gold Rush, but acting altogether, desiring to spend her days doting on her new husband. The world wasn't yet aware that Gray was pregnant or had gotten pregnant out of wedlock. Because she'd show the physical effects as filming continued, Chaplin had actually fired his teenage wife from The Gold Rush and then replaced her in the movie with actor Georgia Hale. Bela Lugosi refused to be an unrecognizable monster. Universal Pictures owed much of the early 1930s horror film renaissance to actor Bela Lugosi, who became a sensation after he starred in Dracula, 1931. With his striking Hungarian accent, intense eyes, and otherworldly presence, Lugosi quickly became associated with sophisticated, menacing roles. Naturally, Universal wanted to make the most of his newfound fame, and the studio initially intended for Lugosi to portray the creature in its next big horror offering, Frankenstein, also 1931. However, playing Frankenstein's monster was a far cry from playing Count Dracula. On the set, Lugosi discovered that the role was almost nothing like he'd imagined. Instead of giving him lines that would allow him to seduce or terrify through speech, or granting him a subtle, grand manner befitting a leading man, the monster was conceived as a hulking, inarticulate brute, a silent, heavily made-up figure whose face would remain virtually hidden beneath layers of gruesome prosthetics. Lugosi, a classically trained European actor who prided himself on his dramatic abilities, balked at the idea of being reduced to a lumbering mute. He reportedly claimed that such a role was beneath his talents. As a result, Lugosi argued with the filmmakers and resisted the makeup tests that would have rendered him unrecognizable. He felt that this kind of part wouldn't just fail to showcase his abilities, it would also damage the star image he'd carefully cultivated. Ultimately, the producers and director James Whale concluded that Lugosi's sensibilities, or his ego, as some accounts suggest, made him ill-suited for the project. Universal fired Lugosi from Frankenstein and replaced him with a then little-known English character actor named Boris Karloff, who embraced both the makeup and the pathos of the silent, tragic creature. The firing proved ironically beneficial for everyone except Lugosi. Karloff became an instant icon. Frankenstein became a horror classic, and the monster went down in cinema history. Lugosi's refusal to vanish behind monstrous makeup might seem like an odd, pride-driven decision to contemporary fans, especially when so many actors today relish the challenge of transformative roles. But in the rigid studio system and star-making machinery of early Hollywood, image mattered greatly. For Bela Lugosi, surrendering that image without a spoken word or a recognizable face was a line he would not cross. And so, he lost what would become one of the most famous roles in cinematic history. May Wong was deemed too Chinese for a Chinese role. May Wong was a pioneering Chinese-American actress who found success in Hollywood during the silent era, standing out in films like Piccadilly, 1929, and Daughter of the Dragon, 1931. With her striking looks, poised performance style, and hard-won credentials, Wong hoped that the advent of sound pictures would bring her even better, more substantial roles that accurately reflected her heritage and talent. But Hollywood's deeply ingrained racism and narrow casting decisions stymied her aspirations again and again. The most galling and well-documented incident occurred in the mid-1930s when MGM began casting for The Good Earth, an adaptation of Pearl S. Buck's Pulitzer Prize-winning novel about Chinese peasant farmers. Wong naturally seemed like the perfect choice for Olan, the dignified and long-suffering heroine. She was one of the few bankable Asian American stars in Hollywood, and she wanted the role badly. But the studio decided otherwise. They cast white actress Louise Rayner in Yellowface as Olan, while offering Wong the lesser villainous part of Lotus, a deceitful and morally questionable character. Insulted by the suggestion that she play a caricatured dragon lady, when she was clearly the top candidate for the lead, Wong declined the lesser part. MGM dropped Wong from the production altogether, effectively firing her before she even stepped in front of the camera. The reason was as bizarre as it was offensive. The studio executives believed that American audiences wouldn't accept a love story between two authentically Asian leads. In other words, May Wong was effectively deemed too Chinese to play a Chinese heroine. This decision not only robbed Wong of what could have been her defining role in an era star-making film, but it also highlighted Hollywood's hypocritical and racist casting practices. Wong's firing from The Good Earth remains a notorious example of Golden Age Hollywood's distorted standards and prejudiced reasoning. A strange, devastating irony in which the only major Asian American star of the period was passed over for a character of her own ethnicity because she was too authentic. Lana Turner's refusal to dress down led to her dismissal. By the 1950s, Lana Turner was an established leading lady and a glamorous Hollywood icon. Renowned for her beauty, Turner had risen to stardom in films like The Postman Always Rings Twice and Green Dolphin Street. She was known for embodying sophistication and style, often appearing in roles that accentuated her fashionable looks. But this image consciousness would cost her a part in Otto Preminger's courtroom drama, Anatomy of a Murder, 1959. Preminger, an innovative and exacting director, insisted on realism. He wanted the film's female protagonist, Laura Mannion, the troubled wife of a murder defendant, to have a believable, somewhat plain appearance. He envisioned simple costumes that reflected the character's small-town life rather than movie star elegance. Turner, however, didn't share this vision. She reportedly balked at the prospect of wearing the more modest wardrobe that Preminger had chosen. She wanted outfits that matched her own star persona, glamorous attire that would emphasize her allure rather than the character's ordinariness. This disagreement over clothing escalated quickly. Turner's refusal to cooperate with Preminger's aesthetic demands was seen as undermining the director's artistic integrity and the film's authenticity. After a series of conflicts, Preminger and the studio decided that Turner's insistence on Hollywood glam over character-driven realism simply would not work. They fired her from the production and promptly replaced her with the younger, more cooperative Lee Remick, who embraced the director's vision without complaint. The firing of Lana Turner from Anatomy of a Murder for something as seemingly trivial as a costume dispute shows how the controlling hands of directors and studios could collide with a star's carefully tended image. In the Hollywood of old, even a powerhouse leading lady could find herself out of a job if she refused to surrender to a film's creative direction, and this time the sticking point was what she wore. Larry Parks lost his career for refusing to name names. In the late 1940s, Larry Parks seemed poised to remain a Hollywood fixture. He had delivered a star-making performance in The Jolson Story, 1946, a box office hit that earned him an Academy Award nomination and established him as one of Columbia Pictures' bright young leads. Parks' charm, his stirring portrayals, and his wholesome image made him a reliable and bankable commodity in the studio system. He followed The Jolson Story with Jolson Sings Again, 1949, cementing his reputation as a talented, versatile actor. But just a few years later, Parks would find himself swiftly and shockingly pushed out of Hollywood, not for poor performance, tardiness, or contractual disputes, but for reasons rooted in the paranoid and unforgiving politics of the era. In the early 1950s, the House Un-American Activities Committee, HUAC, undertook its crusade against alleged communist influence in the film industry. Many performers, writers, and directors were called to testify, forced to either repudiate past leftist associations or risk their livelihoods by refusing to cooperate. When Parks was summoned in 1951, he made a heart-wrenching decision. He admitted that he had been briefly involved with the Communist Party years prior, acknowledging the fact openly. Yet Parks drew the line at naming others who had participated. He tearfully begged the committee not to force him into becoming an informer, expressing remorse for his past, but refusing to betray colleagues or friends. This stance, simultaneously penitent and principled, was not what Hollywood's powerful wanted to hear. The era's climate of fear and conformity demanded total compliance. By refusing to give HUAC the names it wanted, Parks became a liability to his studio. Columbia Pictures, wary of scandal, political repercussions, and industry boycotts, chose to distance itself immediately. The studio canceled Parks' contract and effectively blacklisted him from future major roles. His once promising career was eviscerated almost overnight. In stark contrast to firings over artistic disagreements, lateness, or personal quirks, the stuff of old Hollywood lore, Parks' ouster was uniquely grim and serious. He was dismissed not for any failure on set or box office disappointment, but because he had made the moral choice not to destroy others to save himself.